A vision across the water. Picture, if you will, the year 1867. The American Civil War has ended, leaving a nation both wounded and hungry for renewal. In the bustling streets of Manhattan, horse-drawn carriages clatter over cobblestones while steam rises from countless chimneys into the grey winter sky. The city pulses with ambition, with the restless energy of a place that knows it stands on the threshold of something magnificent. And there, standing at the edge of the East River, is a man whose vision will challenge the very limits of what humans believe possible. John Augustus Roebling, a name that would become synonymous with bridging the impossible. But in this moment, as he gazes across the choppy waters separating Manhattan from Brooklyn, he is simply an engineer with an audacious dream. The weight he carries is not unlike your own, the burden of seeing what others cannot yet imagine, of believing in something so grand that it frightens even those who might benefit from it most. You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when you first glimpsed what you're building, when the vision was so clear in your mind that you could almost touch it, yet so ambitious that speaking it aloud felt like madness. Roebling had been here before, in smaller ways. His wire rope business had revolutionized industry. His suspension bridges over the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh, over the Niagara Gorge. These had established him as more than just another engineer. He was a man who understood that the greatest structures are built not just with steel and stone, but with unwavering conviction. The East River presented a different challenge entirely. Nearly 1,600 feet of churning water separated two cities that were, in many ways, more foreign to each other than either was to distant European capitals. Brooklyn, though America's fourth largest city, remained Manhattan's country cousin, a place of farms and small communities, of ferry-dependent residents who planned their lives around tide tables and weather reports. Every morning, thousands of people crowded onto steam ferries, their lives held hostage by fog, ice, and the temperamental moods of the river. In winter, when ice flows made passage treacherous, entire neighborhoods found themselves effectively cut off from the economic heart of the region. It was, as one newspaper editor wrote, like trying to run a business with one hand tied behind your back. But Roebling saw something else entirely. Where others saw an obstacle, he envisioned a pathway. Where they saw risk, he calculated possibility. The bridge he proposed would not merely span water, it would unite two worlds. At nearly 1,595 feet, it would be the longest suspension bridge ever built. More than that, it would be 50% longer than any existing bridge of its kind. The towers alone would rise higher than any structure in the Western Hemisphere, save for a few cathedral spires. This was not incremental progress. This was a leap into the unknown. You understand this kind of thinking, don't you? The way truly transformative ideas feel both inevitable and impossible at the same time. The way they demand not just technical skill, but a kind of faith that borders on the irrational. Roebling's background had prepared him for exactly this kind of audacious thinking. Born in Prussia, trained as an engineer in Berlin, he had immigrated to America in 1831, with a head full of European engineering principles and a heart full of New World ambition. He had spent decades perfecting the art of wire rope manufacturing, understanding that the strongest structures are built from the accumulation of countless small, perfectly crafted components. His earlier bridges had taught him that suspension bridge design was as much art as science. The interplay of tension and compression, the delicate balance between flexibility and strength, the way wind and weather could transform a solid structure into something that breathed and moved like a living thing. These lessons would prove invaluable in the years ahead. But knowledge alone was not enough. The bridge would require something far more elusive: the confidence of investors, the approval of politicians, the support of two separate city governments with their own agendas and priorities. In 1867, the idea of connecting Manhattan and Brooklyn seemed almost fantastical to many residents. The ferry system, despite its limitations, had created its own rhythms and routines. There was something almost romantic about the daily journey across the water, the way the city revealed itself gradually as you approached the shore, the sense of transition between one world and another. Why risk destroying that for something as uncertain as a bridge? Roebling understood that selling his vision would require more than technical drawings and engineering specifications. He would need to help people imagine a future they had never considered. A future where distance was no longer defined by water, where the economic potential of both cities could be fully realized. The surveys began in earnest that winter. Roebling and his team spent countless hours measuring water depths, analyzing soil compositions, studying wind patterns and tidal flows. Every detail mattered. At this scale, small miscalculations could become catastrophic failures. The East River, they discovered, was not merely an obstacle to be crossed. It was a complex, living system with its own moods and challenges. The currents were stronger than anticipated. The bedrock lay deeper beneath layers of silt and debris. The winter weather made accurate measurements nearly impossible on many days. But with each challenge, Roebling's conviction only grew stronger. This was exactly the kind of problem he had spent his life preparing to solve. The greater the difficulty, the more magnificent the eventual triumph would be. By spring of 1867, word of the bridge proposal had begun to spread through both cities. Newspaper editorials debated its feasibility. Business leaders calculated its potential economic impact. Engineers argued over its technical specifications in professional journals and private clubs. The response was mixed, to say the least. Some saw it as exactly the kind of bold infrastructure investment that would cement New York's position as America's greatest city. Others viewed it as a dangerous folly that would waste enormous sums of money on an unproven technology. Still others worried about the disruption to existing ferry businesses, to established patterns of commerce and daily life. You know this resistance, don't you? The way truly innovative ideas often face their strongest opposition, not from ignorance, but from the very people who understand the existing system well enough to fear its disruption. Roebling pressed forward with quiet determination. He refined his designs, addressed technical concerns, and began the delicate work of building political support. The project would require unprecedented cooperation between Manhattan and Brooklyn, two cities with very different priorities and perspectives. The formation of the New York Bridge Company in 1867 marked the first real step toward making the vision reality. Roebling was appointed chief engineer, a role that would demand every ounce of his technical skill, his leadership ability, and his unwavering faith in what they were attempting to build. The initial optimism was intoxicating. Here was a project that would showcase American engineering prowess to the world. A structure so magnificent that it would stand as a monument to human ingenuity and determination. The kind of achievement that transforms not just skylines, but the very sense of what a civilization might accomplish. But even in those early days of excitement and possibility, there were whispers of the risks involved. Suspension bridge construction was still a relatively new field. The forces involved at this scale were not fully understood. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. Other engineers had attempted similar projects and failed, sometimes catastrophically. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge disaster was still decades in the future, but the fundamental challenges of building at this scale were already apparent to those who understood the physics involved. Roebling himself was acutely aware of these risks. He had studied every suspension bridge failure, analyzed every structural collapse, learned from every mistake made by his predecessors. His designs incorporated safety margins that some considered excessive, redundancies that would prove, in the years ahead, to be absolutely essential. As 1867 drew to a close, the project existed primarily on paper. Thousands of detailed drawings, calculations, and specifications that represented years of careful planning. But the real work, the dangerous, back-breaking, occasionally deadly work of actually building this impossible dream, lay ahead. The East River continued its ancient flow, indifferent to human ambition. The ferries maintained their daily schedules. Life in both cities proceeded much as it always had. But something had changed. A vision had been planted, plans had been drawn, and the first tentative steps toward the impossible had been taken. What lay ahead would test not just engineering principles, but human courage, family bonds, and the very limits of what one generation might sacrifice to build something for the next. The story that was about to unfold would span more than a decade, would claim lives, challenge assumptions, and ultimately create something so beautiful and enduring that it would inspire countless others to attempt their own impossible dreams. But that is a story for the hours ahead. For now, rest in the knowledge that every great achievement begins exactly where you are, with a vision that seems too large, too risky, too audacious for the world as it currently exists. And yet, shadows and setbacks. Yet sometimes, in the space between vision and reality, fate intervenes in ways we cannot predict or prepare for. The summer of 1869 brought with it the kind of cruel irony that would make even the most steadfast among us question whether some dreams are simply too ambitious, too costly in ways we never imagined when we first dared to reach beyond what seemed possible. John Augustus Roebling stood at the edge of the Fulton ferry slip on that warm June afternoon, his practiced eye surveying the East River's currents, his mind calculating angles and measurements for the bridge towers that would soon rise from these very waters. At 63, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades understanding that in engineering, as in life, the smallest oversight can cascade into catastrophe. He was positioning himself to take compass readings when the ferry Westfield approached the slip. Perhaps his attention was too focused on his calculations. Perhaps the weight of the enormous project ahead had consumed more of his awareness than he realized. The ferry, heavy with passengers returning from their day in Manhattan, struck the pilings with more force than usual. The massive timbers shifted. Roebling's right foot, caught between the dock and the crushing weight of the ferry, was mangled in an instant. For a man who had built his life on precision, on the careful management of forces and stresses, the randomness of the accident must have felt like a betrayal of everything he understood about how the world worked. One moment, he was the master engineer, surveying his greatest challenge. The next, he was simply a man in extraordinary pain, his foot crushed beyond recognition. Those who witnessed the accident would later say that Roebling remained remarkably calm. Even as others rushed to help him, even as the severity of his injury became apparent, he maintained the composure that had carried him through every previous crisis. Perhaps he understood, even then, that panic serves no purpose when what's done cannot be undone. The doctors did what they could. They amputated his toes, cleaned the wound, spoke optimistically about recovery. But in 1869, even the simplest injuries carried risks that we can barely imagine today. Infection was always waiting, always patient. Roebling returned to his home in Brooklyn Heights, to the same rooms where he had spent countless nights refining his bridge designs, calculating load distributions, dreaming of the span that would unite two great cities. Now those same rooms became his sickbed, and the drawings spread across his desk began to feel less like blueprints for the future and more like monuments to ambition cut short. Tetanus set in within days. The same hands that had drawn the elegant curves of suspension cables began to stiffen. The mind that had conceived of towers reaching higher than any structure in America began to cloud with fever and pain. For 2 weeks, John Roebling fought. His family gathered around him. His wife Johanna, his children, and most significantly, his son Washington, who had already proven himself as an engineer in his own right. They watched as the man who had seemed capable of conquering any technical challenge struggled against an enemy that no amount of engineering brilliance could defeat. On July 22, 1869, John Augustus Roebling died. The news spread through New York like ripples across still water. The man who had promised to build the impossible bridge, the visionary who had convinced skeptical investors and cautious politicians to believe in his dream, was gone before the first stone of the first tower had been laid. In the boardrooms of the New York Bridge Company, emergency meetings convened. Some directors whispered that perhaps this was a sign, that the bridge project should be abandoned before it claimed any more lives. The technical challenges had always seemed daunting, but now they loomed even larger without the steady hand of the master engineer to guide them through. Others spoke of finding a replacement, of hiring another engineer with the experience and reputation to take on such an unprecedented project. But where do you find someone willing to step into the shadow of John Roebling's death? Where do you find someone with both the technical knowledge and the almost mystical confidence required to build something that had never been built before? The answer, it turned out, had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Washington Augustus Roebling had grown up in the world of cables and towers, of precise calculations and bold engineering dreams. Born in 1837, he had watched his father build suspension bridges across America, had absorbed the principles of engineering not through textbooks alone, but through the lived experience of seeing vision transformed into steel and stone. Unlike his father, Washington had received formal engineering education at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. But more importantly, he had served as his father's assistant on previous bridge projects, learning not just the science, but the art of managing the thousand details that separate successful construction from costly failure. When the Civil War erupted, Washington had set aside his engineering career to serve with distinction in the Union Army. He had seen action at Gettysburg, had risen to the rank of colonel, had learned lessons about leadership under pressure that no engineering school could teach. The experience had tempered him, had shown him that even the most carefully laid plans must sometimes be abandoned in favor of improvisation and courage. Now, at 32, he found himself inheriting not just his father's position as chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge, but something far more complex and burdensome. He inherited the weight of a dream that had already claimed one life, the pressure of expectations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, and something else that was just beginning to take shape in the public consciousness. People were starting to whisper about a curse. It began quietly, as these things often do, in the taverns near the construction site, in the parlors of Brooklyn Heights, in the editorial offices of newspapers that had initially supported the bridge project. People began to wonder aloud whether some projects were simply not meant to be completed. John Roebling's death, they said, was too convenient, too perfectly timed to be mere coincidence. Here was a man who had built bridges his entire career without serious mishap, and yet the moment he began work on his greatest project, he was struck down by what seemed like a random accident. Perhaps the East River itself was fighting back. Perhaps there were forces at work that engineering could not calculate, that human ambition could not overcome. Perhaps the bridge was cursed from the very beginning, doomed to consume the lives of those who dared to challenge the natural order. Washington Roebling heard these whispers, of course. In a city like New York, rumors travel faster than engineering reports. But if the growing superstition troubled him, he gave no outward sign. He had inherited his father's drawings, his father's calculations, his father's unshakable belief that the bridge could and would be built. More than that, he had inherited his father's understanding that great achievements require great sacrifices, not necessarily the ultimate sacrifice that his father had made, but the daily sacrifice of comfort, of certainty, of the simple life that most people take for granted. Standing in his father's study for the first time as chief engineer, surrounded by the meticulous drawings and calculations that represented years of visionary thinking, Washington must have felt the full weight of what he was accepting. This was no longer just a job, no longer just an engineering challenge to be solved through careful application of scientific principles. This was a legacy. This was a promise made to a dying father and to a city that desperately needed to believe that some dreams were still possible, even in the face of tragedy. The bridge company's directors, meeting in emergency session, officially appointed Washington Roebling as chief engineer on August 23, 1869. The vote was unanimous, but the silence in the room afterward spoke volumes. Everyone present understood that they were asking a young man to complete a project that had already proven fatal, under circumstances that seemed designed to invite failure. Washington accepted the appointment with the same quiet dignity his father had shown throughout his career. He made no grand speeches, offered no dramatic promises. He simply committed himself to the work ahead, knowing that every decision he made would be measured not just against engineering standards, but against the growing mythology of the cursed bridge. As autumn approached and the first serious construction work began, Washington Roebling found himself carrying burdens that no engineering textbook had prepared him for. The technical challenges were immense, yes, but they were at least quantifiable. The weight of his father's death, the pressure of public expectation, the whispered fears about supernatural opposition to the project. These were forces that could not be calculated, could not be engineered away. And yet, he pressed forward, because that is what builders do. We carry the weight of those who came before us. We honor the dreams that others could not live to see completed, and we find ways to transform tragedy into determination. The shadow of John Roebling's death would hang over the bridge project for years to come. But in that shadow, his son was learning to work with a different kind of light, the steady, patient illumination that comes from understanding that some things are worth finishing, no matter the cost. The work, was just beginning. Beneath the river's surface, the work began beneath the water, in chambers that had never existed before, spaces carved from the very river itself. To build a bridge that would touch the sky, Washington Roebling first had to descend into darkness. The foundations of greatness, he was learning, are always laid in places where others cannot see. The caissons were marvels of engineering ambition, massive wooden and iron boxes, each the size of a city block, designed to be sunk into the riverbed. Inside these chambers, men would work in compressed air, digging through mud and rock and the accumulated debris of centuries, clearing space for the stone foundations that would anchor the bridge towers. It was work that demanded a peculiar kind of courage. Not the sudden bravery of a moment's crisis, but the steady determination to descend each morning into an alien world, knowing that the river pressed against the walls with the weight of eternity. You understand this kind of pressure, don't you? The weight that builds slowly, imperceptibly, until you realize you're carrying something that would have seemed impossible just months before. The way responsibility accumulates, like sediment, layer upon layer, until you're working in conditions no one else can fully comprehend. The caisson for the Brooklyn Tower was the first to be sunk. As it descended through the water, then settled onto the riverbed, the real work began. Inside, the air was thick and strange, compressed to twice normal pressure to keep the river from flooding in. Every breath felt heavy, substantial, as if the very atmosphere had weight. The men who worked in these chambers moved through a world transformed. Sound traveled differently in the compressed air, voices carried an odd resonance, and the constant hammering of picks and shovels created a rhythm that seemed to pulse through their bones. The light from oil lamps flickered strangely, casting shadows that danced with unusual intensity. Hour by hour, shift by shift, they dug deeper. Through river mud that clung like memory, through layers of sand and clay that told the story of the river's ancient changes, through debris left by ships that had foundered in storms decades past. The work was methodical, relentless. Each shovelful of earth brought them closer to bedrock, closer to the solid foundation that would support everything Washington was trying to build. But it also brought new challenges, new dangers that no engineering textbook had prepared them for. Some men couldn't tolerate the pressure. They would emerge from the caisson gasping, disoriented, their bodies rebelling against the unnatural conditions. Others discovered that leaving too quickly brought its own torment, a mysterious affliction that would later be understood as decompression sickness, but which the workers simply called the bends. It struck without warning. A man would finish his shift, climb the long ladder to the surface, and then collapse in agony. His joints seizing, his vision blurring, his body paying the price for moving too quickly between two different worlds. Washington watched his workers suffer and felt each case like a personal failure. This was the weight of leadership he hadn't anticipated. Not just the technical challenges, but the human cost of every decision. Every innovation demanded its price in flesh and blood and sleepless nights. You know this calculus, don't you? The way each choice ripples outward, affecting people whose names you know, whose families depend on what you're building. The way success and responsibility become inseparable, until you can no longer tell where your vision ends and your obligation begins. As the Brooklyn caisson descended foot by foot through 40 feet of river bottom, Washington spent more and more time in the compressed air chambers himself. He needed to understand what his men were experiencing, needed to see firsthand the conditions he was asking them to endure. The descent into the caisson was like entering another realm, down the long shaft, past the point where natural light faded to memory, into air so thick it seemed to push back against movement. The walls sweated constantly, moisture condensing from the compressed atmosphere and running in steady streams toward the excavation floor. The smell was indescribable, river mud and human sweat and the metallic tang of iron tools, all concentrated by the pressure into something that seemed to coat the inside of your lungs. And underneath it all, the constant awareness that only the artificial atmosphere stood between the workers and the crushing weight of the river above. In this strange underworld, Washington found a different kind of clarity. The surface concerns, the newspaper criticism, the political maneuvering, the endless questions about costs and schedules, all of that faded into irrelevance. Here there was only the work itself, the immediate, tangible progress of moving earth and stone, of carving space from chaos. But the human body wasn't designed for such conditions. As weeks turned to months, Washington began to feel the effects of repeated exposure to the compressed air. Headaches that lingered long after he returned to the surface, joint pain that seemed to settle deeper with each descent, a fatigue that rest couldn't cure. He pushed through it, as leaders do. There was too much at stake, too many people depending on the project's success. The Manhattan caisson had to be sunk as well. Through even more challenging conditions, deeper foundations, harder rock. The Manhattan side presented its own unique torments. The bedrock lay deeper here, much deeper than anyone had anticipated. The caisson had to descend through 78 feet of river bottom, through layers of quicksand that seemed to fight every foot of progress, through pockets of gas that could ignite without warning. Fire was the terror that haunted every shift. In the compressed air, flames burned with frightening intensity. A carelessly handled lamp could become an inferno in seconds, and in the confined space of the caisson, with only one escape route to the surface, fire meant almost certain death. Washington instituted strict protocols. No smoking, no open flames except under controlled conditions, constant vigilance for the smell of gas. But the danger remained, a constant companion to every worker who descended into the depths. The psychological toll was as brutal as the physical one. Men worked in artificial twilight, surrounded by the groaning of timber under pressure, the constant drip of condensation, the knowledge that they were suspended in a bubble of air beneath tons of water and earth. Some couldn't handle the claustrophobia, the sense of being buried alive while still breathing. Others were broken by the bends. The mysterious affliction struck the strongest workers as readily as the weak, leaving some permanently crippled, others dead. The medical understanding of decompression sickness wouldn't come for years. So Washington and his men faced it as earlier generations had faced plague, with courage and ignorance in equal measure. Through it all, Washington pushed himself harder than anyone. He spent longer shifts in the caissons, took on the most dangerous inspections personally, refused to ask his men to face anything he wouldn't face himself. It was leadership by example, but it was also slowly killing him. The symptoms crept up gradually, as the most serious threats always do. The headaches became constant companions. His joints ached with a deep, grinding pain that seemed to emanate from his bones themselves. His coordination began to suffer, small tremors in his hands that made writing difficult, a slight unsteadiness that he tried to hide from his workers. Still, he continued. The Manhattan caisson was nearing bedrock. Just a few more feet, a few more weeks of the crushing routine. He told himself he could endure anything for that long, that once the foundations were complete, he could rest, recover, return to the surface world permanently. But the river had other plans. The attack, when it came, was swift and merciless. Washington was inspecting the excavation face when the familiar pain in his joints suddenly intensified beyond endurance. His vision blurred, his legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the muddy floor of the caisson, his body finally rebelling against months of abuse. They carried him to the surface. This man, who had descended so many times into the depths, now helpless as a child. The compressed air had done its work, leaving him partially paralyzed, his nervous system damaged in ways that 19th century medicine couldn't fully understand or treat. As Washington lay in his sickbed, barely able to move, the Great Bridge Project faced its darkest hour. The chief engineer was broken, the foundations were incomplete, and the public was beginning to whisper that the curse of the Brooklyn Bridge had claimed its second victim. But in the window of his bedroom in Brooklyn Heights, where he could see the half-built towers rising from the river, Washington Roebling was discovering that some battles are won not through strength, but through the willingness to find new ways to fight. The work beneath the water had nearly destroyed him, but it had also taught him something about foundations, about the invisible structures that support everything we build, about the price of creating something that will outlast the pain of its making. And in that hard-won wisdom, in the darkness of his recovery, the next chapter of the bridge was already beginning to take shape, the silent builder. In the quiet of his sick room, Washington Roebling found himself facing a truth that perhaps only those who carry the weight of great endeavors can truly understand. The bridge, his father's vision, the dreams of a city. All of it now rested in hands that could barely hold a pen. But there was another pair of hands in that room, steady hands that had already been carrying more than anyone realized. Emily Warren Roebling had married an engineer, but she had become something far more extraordinary. In those first difficult months of Washington's recovery, as he struggled with the effects of his illness, she began to see the bridge not just as her husband's burden, but as something she herself might help to bear. She was 31 years old, the daughter of a state senator, educated beyond what was common for women of her time. She had studied mathematics, languages, the kind of broad learning that sharpened the mind for complex thinking. But nothing had prepared her for this. The bridge company was growing restless. Investors whispered about delays. The press speculated about Washington's condition. Every day that passed without clear leadership was a day that doubt crept deeper into the project's foundation. And so Emily began to do what countless others in your position have done when everything depends on moving forward. She learned, she adapted, she became what the situation demanded, even when the world wasn't ready to accept it. Washington, confined to his room overlooking the construction site, could still see the bridge taking shape. His mind remained sharp, his understanding of the engineering as precise as ever, but his body, his voice, his ability to be present where decisions were made, these had been taken from him. Emily became his presence. At first, it was simple enough. She would sit with him as he reviewed plans, listen as he explained modifications, take notes as he dictated instructions. Then she would carry these messages to the site, to the assistant engineers, to the foreman who needed guidance. But the men building the bridge quickly realized something remarkable. Emily Warren Roebling wasn't just delivering her husband's words. She understood them. When they had questions, when they needed clarification, when problems arose that demanded immediate decisions, she could think through the engineering principles herself. She had absorbed not just the technical details, but the deeper logic of how the bridge worked, how each cable related to the others, how the weight would distribute, how the materials would respond to stress and weather and time. The assistant engineers, men who had initially spoken to her with the careful politeness reserved for the boss's wife, began to seek her input directly. The foreman who had once waited uncomfortably for her to relay Washington's instructions started explaining their challenges to her as they would to any engineer. This was 1872. Women didn't run construction projects. Women didn't make engineering decisions. Women didn't stand on construction sites giving orders to crews of men working with steel and stone, but the bridge needed to be built. And Emily Warren Roebling was the person who could make that happen. She faced the skepticism you know well, the questioning of every decision, the assumption that she couldn't possibly understand what she was doing, board members who spoke around her rather than to her, contractors who tested her knowledge, hoping to find the limits of her understanding. But Emily had learned something that perhaps only comes from watching someone you love pour everything into an impossible project. She had learned that the work itself, the quality of the decisions, the results on the site, these speak louder than any prejudice. When she solved a problem with the cable spinning, when she caught an error in the calculations, when she made a decision that saved time and money, the bridge itself became her advocate. The construction began to move with new rhythm under her guidance. She established systems, communication flows, ways of ensuring that Washington's vision reached every level of the work while adapting to the realities they discovered each day. She would spend her mornings with Washington, reviewing progress, discussing challenges, planning the day's priorities. Then she would travel to the site, walking among the workers, checking on progress, making decisions that couldn't wait for consultation. The men building the bridge, these rough, practical workers who had initially watched her with curiosity, began to respect something they saw in her approach. She didn't pretend to know what she didn't know, but when she spoke about something, when she made a decision, it was clear she understood not just the immediate issue, but how it connected to everything else. She learned to read the moods of the construction site, to sense when crews were struggling, to spot potential problems before they became crises. She developed relationships with the suppliers, the city officials, the journalists who covered the project's progress, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Emily Warren Roebling became the bridge's chief engineer in all but name. The irony wasn't lost on her. In a world that told women they were too delicate for serious work, she was overseeing one of the most demanding construction projects ever attempted. In a society that insisted women couldn't understand technical matters, she was making engineering decisions that would affect the bridge for decades. But perhaps what sustained her wasn't defiance of these limitations, but something deeper. A recognition that the bridge was larger than any individual, that it required whatever combination of skills and dedication and persistence could be brought to bear. She was building something that would outlast all the small minds who questioned her presence there, something that would serve the city long after the whispers about propriety were forgotten. Washington, watching from his window, saw his wife becoming something he had never imagined when they married. Not just the partner he had fallen in love with, but a builder in her own right. Someone who could carry the weight of impossible expectations, who could make decisions under pressure, who could earn respect in a world determined to withhold it. The bridge was teaching them both about hidden strengths, about the resources we discover only when everything depends on finding them. Emily began to see patterns in the work, inefficiencies that could be improved, ways to coordinate the different teams more effectively. She wasn't just implementing Washington's plans anymore. She was improving them, adapting them, making them work better in practice than they had existed in theory. The cables were rising now, the great suspension system that would carry the bridge's weight taking shape against the sky. Every day brought new challenges, new decisions, new problems that required the kind of judgment that comes only from deep understanding of the project's goals. And Emily Warren Roebling was making those decisions. Not as someone's representative, not as a temporary substitute, but as the person who understood the bridge better than anyone else, still able to guide its construction. The newspapers began to take notice. Here was a story that captured something remarkable about human determination, a woman stepping into a role that society insisted was impossible, and succeeding not through luck or favor, but through competence and dedication that couldn't be denied. But Emily herself seemed less interested in the novelty of her position than in the work itself. The bridge was what mattered, the vision her husband had inherited from his father, the promise made to a city, the dream of connecting what had never been connected before. She carried this responsibility with the same quiet determination that you bring to your own impossible projects, the same willingness to do whatever the work required, to become whoever the situation demanded, to persist when persistence seemed pointless. The bridge was teaching her, as it had taught Washington, as it had taught his father, that the greatest projects change not just the world around them, but the people who build them. By 1875, 3 years after Washington's collapse, Emily Warren Roebling had become something unprecedented in American engineering. She was the de facto chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge, a position she held not through appointment or recognition, but through the simple fact that she was the person doing the work. The bridge was rising, the towers stood complete, the cables stretched between them like the strings of some enormous instrument, ready to carry the weight of the roadway that would soon span the East River. And the person overseeing this transformation, making the daily decisions that turned vision into reality, was someone the world had never expected to find in that role. Emily Warren Roebling had become the silent builder, the invisible engineer, the person whose name would be largely forgotten by history, but whose hands had shaped one of the world's great monuments. She had learned what you perhaps are learning in your own work, that the most important contributions are often the ones no one sees, that the greatest strength sometimes emerges from the willingness to do what needs doing, regardless of whether the world is ready to acknowledge it. The bridge was almost finished now, and it would stand as a testament not just to the vision of the men who had designed it, but to the quiet determination of the woman who had made it real. Weaving the cables. But the greatest test still lay ahead, for all the triumph of those foundations, for all the majesty of those towers rising into the sky. The Brooklyn Bridge would live or die by its cables. 4 massive cables, each one containing over 5,000 individual wires, each wire spun with mathematical precision across that 800-foot span. This was the heart of the suspension bridge, the innovation that would allow them to bridge a distance that had never been bridged before. The process they would use was called aerial spinning, and watching it unfold was like witnessing some ancient ritual, performed high above the water, with the precision of clockwork and the grace of a spider weaving its web. Picture this, if you will, a single wire, no thicker than your finger, stretched from the anchorage on the Brooklyn side, up and over the tower, across the vast emptiness above the East River, over the Manhattan Tower, and down to the anchorage on the other side. One wire, spanning the entire bridge. Then another wire, following exactly the same path, and another, and another. Thousands upon thousands of these individual wires, each one laid parallel to its neighbors, each one carrying its share of what would eventually be an enormous load. This was the principle that would make the impossible possible. That many small things, working together, could accomplish what no single large thing could achieve. Perhaps you understand this principle in your own work, the way 1,000 small decisions, 100 careful conversations, dozens of incremental improvements gradually build into something substantial, something that could not have been created all at once, but emerges through patience, through repetition, through the accumulated weight of consistent effort. The men who spun these cables worked with a precision that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker. Each wire had to be tensioned to exactly the right degree. Too loose, and it would sag uselessly. Too tight, and it would snap under its own strain. Each wire had to follow precisely the same path as its neighbors. Deviating by even inches could compromise the entire structure. They used a device called a traveling wheel, a pulley system that rode along a temporary rope stretched between the towers. Back and forth it went, back and forth, carrying wire from one side to the other, like a tireless messenger crossing and recrossing that vast span. The men who operated this system worked on narrow walkways, wooden planks suspended hundreds of feet above the river. From the ground, they looked like ants crawling along invisible threads. The wind up there was constant and unpredictable. On calm days, they could work steadily, methodically. But when storms came, when the wind picked up, the walkways would sway and bounce like violin strings. And yet they continued, day after day, week after week, month after month. The traveling wheel made its endless journeys, each pass adding another wire to the growing bundle. What had started as a few lonely strands, barely visible from the ground, gradually thickened into something substantial, something you could see taking shape. Emily Roebling watched this process with the eye of someone who understood both its beauty and its danger. From her vantage point, she could see the mathematical precision unfolding, the way each wire found its proper place in the grand design. But she could also see the human cost, the workers who moved carefully along those swaying walkways, knowing that a single misstep could mean death. The cables grew slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like watching a child grow or a tree add rings. The change was too gradual to notice from day to day. But over weeks, over months, the transformation became undeniable. What had been empty air between the towers gradually filled with the dark curves of the growing cables. Each cable, when complete, would be nearly 16 inches in diameter, composed of over 5,000 individual wires bound together and wrapped in a protective coating. The strength of these cables was almost incomprehensible, each one capable of supporting weights that would have crushed the mightiest stone bridge. But strength was only part of the equation. The cables also had to be flexible, able to move with the wind, to adjust to changes in temperature, to respond to the varying loads they would carry. This was the genius of the suspension bridge design, that it could be both strong and supple, both permanent and adaptive. The workers who spun these cables developed their own rhythm, their own culture. They were a special breed, comfortable with heights that would terrify most people, skilled in techniques that few others understood. They worked in teams, each man knowing his role, each man depending on the others for his safety. There were accidents, of course. Men fell from the walkways, though miraculously, fewer than anyone had expected. The safety net that stretched beneath the bridge, nicknamed the life net by the workers, saved more than a dozen lives during the construction, but it could not save everyone, and each loss weighed heavily on Emily, on Washington, on everyone who understood the human price of their ambition. The spinning process required perfect weather coordination. Rain made the wires slippery, dangerous to handle. Snow and ice made the walkways treacherous. High winds could snap a wire under tension, sending it whipping through the air like a deadly serpent. So they waited, watched the sky, chose their moments carefully. There were days when the work proceeded like a well-rehearsed dance, the traveling wheel making trip after trip, the workers moving with practiced efficiency, the cables growing steadily thicker, and there were days when everything seemed to go wrong, when equipment failed, when weather turned, when the very air seemed hostile to their efforts. Through it all, Emily maintained her vigil. She had learned to read the subtle signs, the way the cables hung, the sound they made in the wind, the stress patterns that indicated whether the work was proceeding correctly. She had become, in every sense that mattered, the bridge's guardian. Washington, from his window overlooking the construction, watched through field glasses as his wife's quiet authority guided the most delicate phase of the entire project. He could see her moving among the workers, consulting with the foreman, making the small adjustments that kept everything on track. What had begun as necessity had become mastery. The cables themselves began to take on a life of their own. In certain light, they seemed to sing, vibrating at frequencies too low to hear but somehow felt in the chest, in the bones. Birds learned to perch on them, to ride their gentle swaying motion. Children on both sides of the river would gather to watch the endless procession of the traveling wheel, back and forth, weaving the future. As each cable neared completion, the character of the bridge began to change. What had been a collection of separate elements, towers and anchorages and foundations, gradually unified into a single organism. The cables created relationships, connections, a web of forces that bound everything together into something greater than the sum of its parts. This, perhaps, is what you are doing in your own work. Not building something from nothing, but creating connections, weaving together elements that already exist, finding the patterns that transform separate pieces into unified wholes. The cables of your own bridge might be relationships, systems, ideas, but the principle remains the same. Many small things, working together, creating something that could not exist alone. The final wires were spun in the autumn of 1878, more than 4 years after the process had begun. As the last traveling wheel made its final journey across the span, there was a sense of completion, but also of anticipation. The cables were finished, but the bridge was not yet ready to carry its load. The wires had to be compacted, pressed together to eliminate air gaps, to ensure that every strand carried its proper share of weight. Then they had to be wrapped, bound with additional wire to protect against weather, against corrosion, against the countless small forces that could weaken them over time. But standing there, looking up at those 4 massive curves suspended between the towers, Emily Roebling could see her father-in-law's vision finally taking physical form. The bridge existed now, not just as drawings, not just as calculations, but as a tangible thing, a presence that changed the very nature of the river it crossed. The cables would hold. She knew this with the certainty that comes from understanding, from having watched every wire find its place, from having overseen every detail of their creation. They would hold and they would carry, and they would transform 2 separate cities into something new. Had triumph and remembrance. The months that followed were a testament to patience, to the kind of measured persistence that you understand so well. Each day brought the bridge closer to completion. Each week revealed new details that transformed it from an engineering marvel into something approaching art. The roadway took shape, smooth and wide, designed not just for the carriages and pedestrians of 1883, but for whatever the future might bring. Emily found herself walking the span in the early morning hours, when the mist still clung to the river below, when the city was quiet enough to hear the bridge itself, the subtle sounds of a structure finding its equilibrium. These were precious moments, stolen from the endless demands of correspondence and coordination, moments when she could simply be present with what they had built. The weight she carried had changed over these years. What had begun as emergency, as crisis management, had evolved into something deeper. She was no longer simply completing Washington's work or honoring John's vision. She had become the bridge's final architect, the one who would see it through to its ultimate purpose, connecting not just two cities, but past and future, dream and reality. Washington watched from his window as the final preparations began. His body remained frail, marked by those years in the compressed air chambers, but his mind had found a different kind of clarity. He could see what they had accomplished. Not just the physical structure, but the transformation of an impossible idea into daily reality. Ships passed beneath the span now as if it had always been there, as if the river had always been crossed by this graceful arc of steel and stone. The announcement came in early spring of 1883. May 24th would mark the official opening, a celebration befitting what many were already calling the eighth wonder of the world. The preparations themselves became a kind of theatre, a recognition that this moment belonged not just to the Roeblings, not just to the investors and politicians, but to everyone who had watched the bridge rise, wire by wire, stone by stone, over these 14 long years. You understand this feeling, don't you? The moment when something you've built, something you've poured yourself into, finally stands ready to serve its purpose. The mixture of pride and relief, of accomplishment and exhaustion, of joy tinged with the memory of what it cost to get here. The morning of May 24th dawned clear and bright. By sunrise, crowds were already gathering on both sides of the river. These were not just spectators, but witnesses to history. People who understood they were seeing something that would outlive them all. Families came, children who would one day tell their own children about this day, about the moment when two cities became one. President Chester Arthur arrived, accompanied by the governors of New York and Connecticut, by mayors and dignitaries whose names would fade while the bridge endured. But the real ceremony belonged to the ordinary people, the workers who had built it, the families who had waited for it, the dreamers who had believed in it when belief required courage. Emily stood with Washington as the first official procession began. 14 years earlier, such a moment would have been unimaginable, not just because the bridge didn't exist, but because no one could have foreseen that its completion would rest in the hands of a woman whose engineering education had come through necessity, through love, through the simple refusal to let an extraordinary thing fail. The speeches that day spoke of progress, of American ingenuity, of the triumph of human will over natural obstacles. All true, all fitting, but missing perhaps the deeper truth. This bridge existed because three people had understood that some things are worth any sacrifice, that some visions demand everything you have to give, and then ask for more. As the sun set on that first day, as the celebrations wound down and the crowds dispersed, the bridge settled into its true purpose. No longer a marvel, no longer a curiosity, but simply a bridge. People crossed it, as they would cross it tomorrow, and the day after, and for all the days to come. John A. Roebling never saw this moment, but his vision lived in every cable, every stone, every carefully calculated curve. His death had seemed like the end of everything. But death, Emily had learned, is not always the final word. Sometimes what we build outlives not just our bodies, but our ability to imagine how far our influence might reach. Washington would recover, slowly, partially, but enough to see his father's dream completed and his wife's extraordinary contribution recognized. He would live to see automobiles cross the span, to see the bridge adapt to technologies John could never have envisioned, to witness the truth that the best engineering doesn't just solve today's problems, but creates possibilities for futures we cannot yet imagine. And Emily would be remembered, though perhaps not as fully as she deserved, as the woman who saved the Brooklyn Bridge. But she was more than that, wasn't she? She was proof that leadership often emerges from unexpected places, that competence and dedication can overcome any prejudice, that sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows, unrecognized, until the moment when everything depends on it. Tonight, as you carry the weight of your own building, your own impossible thing that demands everything you have, remember this: the Brooklyn Bridge still stands, still carries its daily burden of traffic and dreams and human ambition, still connects what was once separate, still transforms the possible into the routine. The Roeblings understood what you understand, that building something extraordinary requires not just vision, but the willingness to adapt when circumstances change, to find strength you didn't know you had, to trust that the work itself will teach you what you need to know. Their triumph was not just in the completion, but in the persistence, in the refusal to let setbacks become endings, in the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply continue. The bridge remembers them all, holds their story in its cables, carries their legacy in every crossing, as it will carry yours, in whatever you're building, in whatever impossible thing keeps you awake, in whatever bridge you're spanning between the world as it is and the world as it could be. Han whispers on the wind, and so the bridge stands, not merely as stone and steel and wire, but as something more mysterious, something that carries whispers on the wind. There are those who say, on certain nights when the fog rolls in from the harbor, you can still hear the echo of hammers against stone, the distant calls of workers who labored in darkness beneath the river, the quiet determination of a woman who refused to let an impossible dream die. Perhaps it's only the wind through the cables, or perhaps some stories are too powerful to ever truly end. The weight you carry tonight, the impossible thing that keeps your mind turning, it joins a conversation that began long before you, and will continue long after. Every leader who has ever stared at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, calculating whether they can make it work, whether the vision in their head can survive contact with reality, becomes part of this endless dialogue between ambition and doubt, between what is and what could be. The Brooklyn Bridge has watched this city transform around it, seen horse-drawn carriages give way to automobiles, witnessed the skyline grow tall enough to dwarf its towers, watched generations cross its span carrying their own impossible dreams. And through it all, it has remained, not just a crossing, but a reminder that the most audacious visions often require the most ordinary virtue: persistence. Tonight, as you finally allow your shoulders to settle into the pillow, as you feel the day's weight beginning to lift, imagine the bridge in the darkness, its lights reflecting on the water below like scattered stars. The same water that nearly claimed Washington Roebling, the same span that Emily walked every morning, checking, adjusting, believing when no one else would. The city sleeps around it, millions of dreams rising and falling like tides, and the bridge holds them all, carries them all, just as it has carried every crossing for more than a century. Your dream, your impossible thing, becomes part of that great carrying, part of that endless faith in tomorrow. There's something profoundly peaceful in this thought, that what you're building, the weight you carry, connects you to everyone who has ever tried to span the impossible distance between vision and reality. You are not alone in this. You never were. The bridge remembers, and in remembering, it whispers that persistence, quiet, steady, relentless persistence, is the most revolutionary act of all. Let your breathing slow now. Let the calculations fade. Let tomorrow's meetings and decisions drift away like morning fog. The bridge will be there when you wake, still spanning, still carrying, still proving that impossible things, given enough time, enough patience, enough refusal to surrender, become the most natural things in the world. The cables sing softly in the night wind, not with triumph, but with something deeper. The quiet satisfaction of work completed, of promises kept, of bridges built not just across rivers, but across time itself, connecting every dreamer who came before with every dreamer yet to come, and you, right now, releasing the day's weight, joining that ancient conversation, becoming part of the bridge, part of the crossing, part of the endless human insistence that tomorrow, somehow, will be better than today.